Hey everybody, my name is Brian Heater. I am the hardware editor at TechCrunch. I am thrilled to be moderating today's panel with three fascinating founders. Please welcome to our virtual stage, Leon Ferrant, the co-founder and CEO of Lion, which is tackling recycling of lithium-ion batteries. Elizabeth Gilligan, the founder and CEO of Material Evolution, a sustainable concrete company, and Matanya Horowitz, the founder and CEO of AMP Robotics, an industrial AI and robotics company that is helping to modernize recycling. It's a great collection of companies and technologies, but and we've discussed this before, the kind of broader challenge of having a conversation like this is attempting to find a common narrative. Obviously all of you are involved in the waste stream. You're all involved with aspects of recycling, but the range of solutions that we're talking about here is about as broad as you could possibly hope for in this conversation, again, including concrete, batteries, and trash sorting robots. So I'm going to start broad and then we can sort of start to drill down from there. Do investors generally regard green tech as being more of a long tail play? Liz, let's start with you.
This is perfect timing because we're actually fundraising. So yeah, for us, especially in concrete, it's a longer play. Definitely the questions are how quickly are we getting to revenue? How long does it take to get accepted in the industry? And how do we become like that industry standard? And what does that look like? So I think definitely for our space in using waste, it's seen as a longer play.
Great. Matanya, you want to take it next?
Yeah, for us, although we're in the recycling industry, our main product, the sorting robots, are really about labor and automation. And so for our investors, they were really looking for short-term evidence that we had strong product market fit. I think when they look at the longer-term trends, things around greenhouse gas emissions, plastics in the ocean, sort of these kind of more macro situational changes, they really see that as tailwinds for the company. And the fundamental thesis is really premised on operational short-term improvements to the recycling industry.
So was that a conscious effort on your part to start with a technology that can be rolled out in the near term and then focus on something a little more long-term in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, for us, we were really fortunate that, so what we do is we use deep learning to create vision systems that let us identify trash or recycling. And then we connect that to different devices like these sorting robots. And what was very fortunate in our application is there was a very clear need for sorting systems. And so we could sort of solve that problem. But then what you find in sort of single stream recycling is there's all these different problems that can be solved with vision systems. And so, for our roadmap, we have additional devices and additional things we want to do over the longer term that deal with sort of progressively larger problems in the recycling industry. But I would say it was fortunate that there was a kind of a shorter term play available as well. But really it was around sort of people standing around conveyor belts sorting stuff by hand in a kind of nasty place.
And Leon, obviously, when we talk about green tech and sustainability, unfortunately, there's very much the presence of a bit of a ticking clock that we're talking about abstractly here. But I think when it comes to what you do in lithium-ion batteries, specifically rare earth materials, there's like very finite wall that the industry is pushing up against right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of crazy to me that we don't recycle more lithium-ion batteries, and the world's been going a couple of decades with recycling single-digit percentages of the waste that we create. And of course, like we've spoke about before, is that it leaks into the earth and it's combustible. So none of that is a good sign. But of course, then on the flip side, we're mining this material constantly, which is expensive, degrading to the planet, and we can take all of those materials out of the batteries that we throw back into the air. So it is there is definitely a finite resource on the precious metals, and up 25 years on some of them that we're using at a rapid pace.
So as far as the other two companies go, and again, more broadly, when we're talking about sustainability, have we hit an inflection point when it comes to green technology and investors' interest in the space, or is that something that is still a ways off?
No, I think from our perspective, we've seen that the appetite for at least our type of business has actually grown. I remember raising kind of at the seed stage, it was actually quite a challenge. And then I think investors have gotten more comfortable with these developments that require a little bit more infrastructure. So in our case, the deployment of robots and kind of actually putting steel in the ground, I think there have been more and more successful ventures over time that have had these elements. And so that comfort is coming to a lot of these kind of greener technologies where you do have real infrastructure that's being built up. So I think on top of that, you then have broader macro trends, but I really see it as kind of more about hardware, VCs getting more comfortable with hardware and that underpinning the changes.
Yeah, I guess maybe to expand the question around inflection point is how seriously investors are taking green technology. I mean, obviously, it's been good publicity, right? It's been nice to be seen as somebody who's investing in green tech. But Liz, as somebody who is like very much going through the process right now, do you find that VCs and investors generally are finally really actually starting to take this stuff seriously?
Yeah, for me, I think they really understand there's money in it. The kind of next businesses are going to be made from sustainable businesses. They're going to be sustainable infrastructure, and that involves recycling and waste materials. Like for me, in this fundraise, it's been amazing to meet investors that are so passionate about how we can change the planet, how we can have that impact, be that through investing, be that through founding, be that through kind of new technologies. And I think the appetite has kind of grown exponentially even since we started the company, just from like founding the tech. And then the legislations that are coming through, that there's just so much tailwind. I feel like before we were kind of at like the carrot stage where it was a nice to have, but now it's getting to the point where it's very much a stick for companies. Like it's going to affect their bottom lines. Like you either change or you die. And that's the point we're at with a lot of kind of companies. And I think VCs have got that. VCs have got that that's where the next unicorn is going to come from, is from these sustainable businesses.
Yeah, and maybe just to build on what Elizabeth was saying, I think there really is broad conviction that, consumer sentiment, people really care about these things. Like they're really really caring about greenhouse gas emissions. They're really caring about, these externalities around pollution, and that's not going away. And so, you can really bank on these broader trends continuing for the long term.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree with the guys. There's been a very recent shift in the sentiment of some investors as well, and I think it's partly driven by governmental, push. And I think that legislatively, the governments are now, making it more important for companies to look after their own waste, and therefore, investors see that there's certainly money to be made out of the next sustainable company, and certainly ones that close the loop and create circular economies, like my fellow panelists are trying to do. So I definitely agree. And the other point I think that Liz and Matanya was speaking about is it does seem like people are becoming more comfortable with hardware investments. It's always really tough to raise the early cash for a capital intensive business. But, the brave jump in and we see really great support from some of them nowadays.
Obviously, all three of you are at a point where, you do have some proof of concept, you are out there, you're getting, you're known, so there is a certain maturity there. But when we're dealing with, again, sustainability, which can to a certain extent have a long tail in hardware, especially, that it takes so long to get off the ground. Does all of that make it difficult to get investors on board in pre-seed seed stage of fundraising?
Yeah, I mean, sorry to just jump in. I think it's incredibly difficult to find investors in some parts of the world that will support such businesses that have such long tail. That we need cash and we need patience in order to build pretty world-changing technology, especially when it's deep tech. It's big machinery and hardware. So it really takes a select few, but I do think it's changing, and it's also region or geographically where you are in the world and what sort of VCs you're near. It makes a big difference, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd add to that there's a lot of grant funding available for it at the moment, especially kind of in the UK and the US for green incentives, which really help early stage hard tech companies. Like grants are the way to get, I would say, investors in, because if the government are willing to kind of invest in it, then it makes it seem kind of de-risks it, allows for those things to be brought forward. So I really think government investment in those kind of new techs is so important.
Is it at that early stage? Is it easier? Not easier. I guess is there less resistance in having that conversation with the government with a grant than there is, versus heading to a room full of VCs with a pitch deck, Liz?
I'd say they're completely different beasts because each of them want different things. So it depends on if you can meet both of them, because they both have very different guidelines of what they want. The government want a really nice project that comes out, whereas a VC wants revenue. Like, how do we generate revenue? So it's getting them both to be balanced is what we found, is how can you exploit that grant to the best of your ability to get your product to market and get over all the hurdles. So it's a hurdle jumping exercise. So it's really great for getting R&D that's kind of risky or isn't working off the ground with non-dilutive funding.
Yeah, and to your question, Brian, about how do the investors get comfortable with it? What I've seen is a lot of, if you're able to, as is true for so many startups, if you're able to break the problem into different chunks and establish, hey, are people going to pay for this if it exists? What is the sentiment once you have sort of a bad demo? And you can kind of get these different stage gates that establish these proof points. I've found that investors can actually be very bullish. I think the hardest thing is when you're looking at some people I know who are doing kind of green things, but it requires you to build up a whole refinery or something like that before you can establish product market fit. And you have to make a huge bet. To the extent you're able to establish product market fit with something that's subscale or something that's smaller, you can really, I think, start to chip away at this sort of capital investment hurdle. Government grants are a great way to do that. So AMP was funded initially by the National Science Foundation here in the United States, and absolutely took advantage of that. It was huge for us.
Leon, what role, if any, have government grants played in your own ability to raise funds?
Unfortunately, we were mistimed from a governmental grant perspective. There weren't any available in Singapore for us to take advantage of at that time. So that was a bit that made it tough. And I completely share Liz's sentiment. The greener and the more impactful the project or the startup, the more support you need from the government. Otherwise, it's so much easier for the panelists, us to go after the big dollars rather than the planet-changing expedition. And I certainly agree that there needs to be more government support for these sort of green projects.
That brings up an interesting point and something that I hadn't considered before. Is there more, if you're dealing with a VC, somebody who is looking to make money out of the gate or even longer term, I guess, is there sort of more incentive to change your goals? If you're taking government funding up front, is it easier to sort of to stay the course, so to speak? Liz, you want to answer that one?
Yes, a really good question. I think we've been so mission driven that we're really looking for the right VCs. Like money's great, like obviously we need that to survive, but the mission's so important. And I think right, like especially now, the mission on how we get to carbon negative or carbon neutral in production and zero waste and circular economy is kind of more important than it's ever been. Like I feel like you can adjust, but it's just not, the tech just doesn't fit. Like for me, it's about authenticity and finding the people who believe in that vision because it's long and hard. It's, you can get it for the money, but you've got another 10 years of that. So even if they give you lots of money, it's a lot of late nights, it's a lot of hard work. So you need to find the people who get that vision, who can help you get to those next steps and can open the doors, because that's kind of what we found is opening the doors to who to talk to and how to move it forward has been kind of changing.
Yeah, Leon, I assume it's sort of a difficult line to walk when you first, end up in that room with the VCs of trying to convince them that that this is a noble cause and that in and of itself is worth the investment in. I mean, again, obviously, they do have a bottom line when it comes to who they're deciding to invest in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, we've been exceptionally blessed with how we've raised money. In our first round, we were asked to raise the funds and everyone kind of came to the party, and the only difficult thing was handling the lawyers and then swallowing their fees. Beyond that, we're now in another round, so we've just started raising again, and it just coincides. It's driven really by external interest and hype. In the States, obviously, with Biden pushing the agenda of making sure that we electrify our transport, and we also take care of the waste that transport creates, and all the EVs coming into the market. So the problem in my space is exploding. And so I guess that with one of the only solutions to fully rejuvenate the spent lithium ion batteries, I'm in a little bit of a unique situation whereby we're being asked to take money at the moment. So we're in the same position where, as Liz, I guess, is making sure that those people really care about our vision and our mission, to make sure that there's no lithium ion batteries going into landfill anymore, and that we don't mine what we don't need. But yeah, certainly it's you need to make the choice of the right money, not the first money.
Yeah, Matanya, how much vetting would you say you're doing on your part in terms of the investors that you're having conversations with and the ones that you're actually accepting funding from?
Yeah, I think in our situation, we actually found it was fairly self-selecting, where it was only those who believed in our vision, which was that this would be this would be an exciting business if if we were successful in changing some of the fundamental economics of the recycling process. And so it was going to be this kind of longer term vision. And I think as a result, our earlier rounds were tough. Everybody has to have a lot of conversations to, I think, have a successful round, although it sounds like Leon's having a lot of success recently. But a lot of investors, basically said, hey, too much needs to go your way, or I don't get recycling, or this sort of thing. And so they passed, and reasonably enough. And the ones who stuck around were those who shared our vision. So I think, it kind of goes both ways. But I also think there's been so many successes where venture-backed companies have stayed private for so long that as a whole, VC is willing to take longer term bets than may have been true in the past. And so I think all of our backers, really see this as a longer term play. It's not just about kind of, in our case, selling the next robot, although we have to sell the next robot. It's really about how do we, help the industry and make it something much bigger than it is today.
So we've been circling around this a little bit. And Leon, I want to start with you on this one, because, you mentioned the company's based in Singapore. You mentioned that from the standpoint of, again, not being able to get a grant at the time. but I'm curious, which global markets right now are you seeing are really kind of the most progressive or aggressive when it comes to adopting sustainable technologies?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because you look at the usual suspects and you look straight to Europe, where legislation has driven recycling and more circular activities than anywhere else in the world, and the States is of course catching up and definitely doing good things. It all starts with legislation typically, but many would be shocked to know that China is decades ahead of many of the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world, with regards to recycling. They understood that you need to control supply chain of precious inputs, whether it be metals or anything else, way before the rest have been catching on. So, for example, they were as soon as lithium-ion batteries were being produced, and even lead acid, they were looking at ways to recycle them and extract the precious metals. So yeah, and then you see the rest of the world catching up. So Singapore's implementing legislation now for end-of-life producers' responsibility. Australia did it and now is starting to enforce. Some of the LATAM countries, and Canada's very good as well. So yeah, it's about legislation, and when governments lead, then recycling and circular activities follow.
Yeah, obviously, there's just because a market is sort of aggressive when it comes to it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to embrace a specific technology. Liz, if we're talking about China right now, one being obviously a ton of people there, two, them being aggressive about recycling, and three, obviously there's just like a tremendous amount of construction happening there. So, from that standpoint, at least it would make sense that could potentially be a fit for you. Is China and Greater Asia, is that a market that you're going after?
Yeah, so obviously I think what China does and how they commoditize waste is clever, because if you create value in it, then everyone starts to care about it. For us, they're not in our kind of next 2-year plan, but it's something we were looking at to see how we could license our technology, because I think the more CO2 we can reduce and at a quicker pace, especially for the cement industry, because it emits just so much in its production, how we can kind of implement that at scale, especially with a country that produces so much steel waste, has so many of those huge industrial byproducts. It's a kind of a great kind of collaboration that we could look for kind of cement companies that are in the industry.
Can you, I'm sure some or most of our viewers know what you're talking about, but can you expand on what it means to commoditize recycling?
So basically, in my opinion, it's to create value from that waste. So if we can make it worth some sort of money, then we can create a market for it. So it becomes a commodity. So how we now start to recycle plastic, and then that could be made into other products. We still keep a value in it. When it keeps its residual value, we can then start to trade with it. So for me, it's such an interesting concept. That's something that has been previously completely devalued and actually cost a company to get rid of. How do you create a value chain in that? How do you create money from, in theory, nothing? And how do you create that value chain so that it's a circular approach, so that materials don't go to landfill, and you create a commodities industry based on kind of waste, which I think is what we're kind of trying to do, is to create that commodities based industry, or hopefully turn it into more than commodities based industry, but start with that and look at how you can feed that back in.
Unfortunately, we're running up against time. So Matanya, I'll put the last question to you. Which markets are the best fit, and which areas and countries are you seeing, being again the most aggressive when it comes to legislation, or just in any way embracing recycling generally?
as Leon mentioned, structurally in Europe, there's been some really strong support for the recycling industry. So they're in some ways ahead, but interestingly, at least for what we're doing, robotics and artificial intelligence, it's actually really having the most traction here in the United States. I think maybe because there's less support, people have been really basing the industry on that commodity value their economics a little bit more sensitive, and so they're much more cost sensitive. So it's been pushing us ahead here. So I would say actually in the United States, it's one of the most fruitful areas for us, at least, and in North America. We are expanding aggressively into Europe. We've also started to put systems into Japan. Really for us, because our system is around labor savings, it's high wage areas. But what we get excited about is the idea that as technology lowers the fundamental costs associated with extracting these commodities, as Elizabeth said, the incentives become stronger. And our hope is that this helps strengthen the recycling industry, not only in the developed world, but actually in the developing world, where a lack of waste management infrastructure is what's caused a number of issues, and plastics in the ocean is one of them. And so over the longer term, we actually think that developing countries may be even more exciting, but right now we're focused on the developed world.
Great. Unfortunately, we are all out of time. Liz, Leon, Matanya, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, TechCrunch.